May 14th is the 59th anniversary of the Freedom Rides through Anniston, Alabama. And on behalf of Jacksonville State University and the Freedom Rider Park Committee, we had planned, along with our National Park Service partners, to have a big event on Gurnee right in front of the old Greyhound Depot. Well, things changed. COVID came to visit and we reconsidered, and now this is a virtual event in celebration of the 59th anniversary and also kicking off a year of events in anticipation of the 60th anniversary. We're so glad to have put together nearly an hour of interviews and information for you, and I'm super happy to have with me my friend Philip Howard. Philip is an advocate for freedom riders, all things freedom riders, all things civil rights. He's from Birmingham. And Philip, thanks so much for being with me to co-host this event.
I am delighted to be here and a strong advocate for freedom riders. But I think my involvement and the freedom riders, what we were planning at Gurnee would have been awesome, but we had to bring it online because of COVID, of course. And I guess it would be interesting if people would be able to understand the beginnings of your involvement with freedom riders and how all of this began, not just the 59th, but going all the way back to the very beginning for yourself.
Well, thanks, Philip. Yeah, I feel like a newbie. I got involved maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it started with Little River Canyon National Preserve, which is a beautiful, beautiful natural area near Fort Payne, Alabama. And in early 1990s, we were able to turn that into a national park. And Philip, it now has 500,000 visitors a year with an economic impact of around $15 million. And it is somewhat of a sensation. The idea dawned on a number of us that the Freedom Riders' story was such an important story in our national history that it might deserve a National Park Service status. And so a group of us worked together, and we were able to lobby Congress, the White House, and we were able to establish Freedom Riders National Monument Preserve as a team effort. And that's kind of when we felt like the dog that caught the school bus. You know, now that we had it, we had to do something. And Dr. Barbara Boyd, State Representative Dr. Barbara Boyd, put together a little committee. And she asked me to serve as the chair. And immediately I asked my friend Dr. Bill Harbor, freedom rider from Piedmont, Alabama, to serve as co-chair. And he said yes. We put together a wonderful team of people, and we came up with plans to develop the site where the bus had actually been burned and develop the area Gurnee Avenue in Anniston as a site for heritage tourism. Now that it has been designated as a unit of the National Park Service, we're able to move forward in its development. And I'm excited that we have a number of folks with the National Park Service helping, and specifically we have Chris Butcher with us to talk about how that will evolve over the years to come. But we now have a national park unit. Jacksonville State University is involved with programming. The Freedom Rider Park Committee, established by Dr. Barbara Boyd, is playing an essential role in its development. The city of Anniston, Calhoun County, but working also now with the city of Birmingham and city of Montgomery to completely tell the Freedom Rider story as best we can. So Philip, how did you get involved with this?
Well, I think, Pete, if you remember, I came over and came to the bus station and immediately was asking, can I volunteer? I was willing to just move boxes just to be in the environment of history, to learn more, to educate myself for one. It has become personal to me. My father, who has since passed last year, but came to this very place in Anniston, Alabama in 1946 and had to ride the back of the bus, back of the trains, all the way here from California. And that experience, and in talking to him as I have about history and his life, Um, he was moved to come back here or to come back south after got out of the Army and to fight for civil rights in the South. And part of his motivation was what happened with the sit-ins beginning in 1960, which led to the events of 1961. He spoke about events like the Freedom Rider as a catalyst for him to get involved. And before he passed, he knew I was working with you and trying to better understand the events of that time, and he was just thrilled. And it led to me to have a desire to just learn more about it, to help others learn about it, and to actually, when we think about Freedom Riders and when we think about history and when we think about the men that we interviewed for this piece, it's not often that you get to be around heroes. It's not often that you get to be around people who understand what courage is, what determination is, what perseverance is. You rarely get a real life example of that. Most of the time it's Hollywood, the Avenger movies. But these are actual heroes, people who impacted not only the city of Anniston, but this country, and in my opinion, made it into, Freedom Riders had to happen for us to understand who we could be and who we'd strive to be since the founding. And so a lot of history for me, a lot of personal experiences for me, wanting to learn more about it. So I've been here ever since, and you hadn't been able to get rid of me, so I appreciate that.
Well, it's been a lot of fun working with you, and speaking of heroes, you've captured some really fantastic interviews.
I guess my children being born is a highlight of my life. Me being married to my wife is a highlight, but interviewing Hank Thomas and Charles Person has been one of the great joys for me.
Well, let's take a look.
Hello, we are delighted to be joined by Mr. Charles Person, Freedom Rider. Mr. Persons, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having us.
You were 18 years old. Can you tell us how you were recruited to be a Freedom Rider?
Well, in Atlanta, we were very successful in our sit-ins and our boycott, and the Congress of Racial Equality had watched all the different movements throughout the South, and they realized there were a tremendous amount of young people who were skilled and trained in nonviolence. So they sent out a call to all the organizations to recruit people. Now, no one knew what a Freedom Ride was at the time, but at that time I would have gone anywhere to fight segregation, no matter where it was. So I applied, and for many, many years I couldn't understand why they chose me, because there were other members who were older than I and just as experienced as I, but they chose me from Atlanta. And I guess within the last 10 years, I realized that one of the reasons they chose me was because I hadn't lived long enough to have any negatives in my background. I was squeaky clean, and that's what I think they were looking for, is someone who had no negatives in their background.
Did the training that you took part in to become a Freedom Rider prepare you for what happened on May 14th, 1961?
Well, the training was extremely well thought out and everything. And our expectation in those days was the worst thing that could possibly happen is they may spit on you, they may pour condiments on you, they may even yank you off the stool or put a cigarette out on you. But that was the extent that we anticipated, the level of violence that we anticipated. There's no way we could have anticipated what actually happened that day.
How were you feeling the night before and the morning of May 14th, 1961?
Well, May 13th was we entered Atlanta, and I got a chance to meet with Dr. King again, and also to sleep in my own bed. So I spent the night at home, and the next day was Mother's Day, so I could, gave Mom a big hug and everything, and we left to join the riders, and of course, that's our day started uh, at the bus station.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and imagine, Mr. Person, I rode a bus before, and you try to get some sleep on a bus if you can. I'm gonna go ahead and imagine you probably did not take a nap on that bus coming from Atlanta.
Well, we never did, and we didn't talk either. That's another thing that people don't understand. Even though, like I said, that was my day on May 14th. My seatmate was Herman, and but we didn't talk. We wanted to not be distracted. We didn't want to get so involved in the conversation that we weren't aware of our surroundings. So we did most of our talking in the evenings when we met because we always had an after action. We summarized the day's events and what went right and what went wrong. And also that was a time they would give us out our allowance because we had to have money because if they ever decided to serve us, it would have been very embarrassing to be served and not have any money.
And so you all leave Atlanta, cross Alabama state line. Was your next stop Birmingham, or did you stop anywhere in between that time, other than the first stop you just mentioned when he got off the bus? Did you go to every town that you were supposed to?
Yeah, we the first stop was Heflin, which is right at the Georgia-Alabama line.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, we went into Anniston.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got to Anniston, the station was closed. And the bus driver got off and he talked with some men that were milling around in front of the station. And then there was a policeman out there and he talked to him. He got back on the bus and he says, I understand the Greyhound bus has been set afire.
Wow.
And they're taking the people to the hospital by the carloads. And he got back off the bus. Now, we knew that our friends were on that bus. And we didn't know, when I think of fire, it is really, to me, even today, is frightening.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not having the advantage of knowing of cell phones and stuff like that. We had no idea how bad it was. The driver got back on the bus. He says, I'm not moving this bus till the niggers get to the back. And of course, we refused. And at that point, 8 gentlemen got on the bus and they started to beat Herman and I and other students and was trying to force us to the back of the bus. When we got midway of the bus, James Peck and Dr. Bergman was the oldest freedom rider. They came to our aid. And that really made them angry. To think that 2 white men would come to aid these students.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, they hit Dr. Bergman and they knocked him to the floor of the bus. And they began to stomp him in his chest. And his wife cried out, hey, and they finally stopped stomping on him and beating on him. And they hit James Peck. James Peck was a bleeder. And when James hit the floor of the bus, his blood covered the floor of the bus. So
Wow.
here you have them forcing us back towards the bus. We're stumbling over Dr. Bergman and James Peck. It was slipping on his blood, and it was just a mess. And
Mm-hmm.
once they got us near the back of the bus, they physically threw us or tossed us to the back.
Mm-hmm.
And one eyewitness says they stacked us like pancakes. But once
Wow.
they had us in the back, and they sat midway of the bus, and they taunted us all the way into Birmingham. Now, it took us 2 hours to get to Birmingham, and that is not a 2-hour ride.
Mm-hmm.
But the bus driver had been warned that there was another mob awaiting our bus. Now, had our bus been set afire, I think we were so badly beaten, I don't know if any of us would have been able to get off. So it was
Wow.
fortunate that we did go into Birmingham in the back way.
You and Mr. Peck were the first ones off the bus?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And as you were pulling up to the bus station, I'm assuming you all were, of course, assaulted on the bus. So I'm assuming still bleeding, still in pain from that assault. What was your mindset as you were approaching the exit of the bus? And did you see a mob outside of the bus, or?
No, it was a trap. They had outside of the waiting room, there was no one. And I looked at Jim and like he was bleeding and everything, but he still wanted to go. So he says, let's go. And we get inside the waiting room and the entire wall was surrounded by men and they all came towards us. And I guess Jim went down almost immediately. And I guess I being younger, I was able to at least maintain my balance. And there was, they had pipes and someone said they even had guns. They had everything. And there's one picture that survives Birmingham, and that's the picture of me being beaten. And when the picture was taken, the men were startled, and they all look up at the camera. And for some reason, they just let me go. I walked away. I didn't run. I didn't cover up anything. I walked away. and then they attacked the photographer. They beat him up. They destroyed his camera, but it was a film pack camera, and one pack, one item, one negative, or one pack, one of the film packs survived, and that's the only evidence we have of what happened in Birmingham.
Can you just take me through the emotions of you getting outside and being able to kind of grasp what just happened when you landed in Birmingham? Were you able to even gather any thoughts about what happened, or was it just I'm glad I'm out of there, or what were you thinking?
Well, I saw one gentleman. They say he was a resident of Birmingham, and they had him up in the air. Uh, at that point, they were beating anyone they thought or suspected of being a freedom riders. And so James and I was in the waiting room, in a white waiting room, and the others were outside trying to, getting their bags and stuff. And they just said that they attacked everybody because there was enough of them there to do that. And I just felt I was dazed and confused, and not, it's a city I'd never been there before. And like I say, I just walked out towards the street, and when the bus came, I got on. And the bus driver saw that I was bleeding, and I just said, "Take me somewhere."
And you make it to Bethel. Did you go to Bethel Baptist Church or
Well, first they tried to took me. They saw the blood when the deacons got there. They saw all the blood. I said, "Well, you need to see a doctor." Well, apparently there were 3 black doctors in Birmingham, and they took me to each one of them's home, and they all refused to treat me. So they said, "Well, we got a nurse back in the church." So they took me back to the church, and this nurse, she looked at my wounds, and she kind of put a special kind of butterfly bandage or something that was supposed to pull my scap together. And that's, the only medical treatment I received.
did you get a chance to call your parents that night, or when was the first time you remember talking to your mom and dad?
Well, let's like this. We didn't have a phone. We were too poor to have a phone.
Okay.
So my next of kin was Lonnie King, who at that time was the leader of the student movement in Atlanta. So they contacted Lonnie, and Lonnie in turn notified my parents. He told them that, it made the 6 o'clock news, the evening news that day, but all they knew is that a bus had been burned and the other folks were beat up. That's only thing they had. But they were Lonnie was able to tell them that I was okay. Yeah, we had been beaten and the other bus had been burned, but we were okay.
When you first heard your mom and dad's voice, did they ever relay to you their thoughts of watching the news that night and what was going through their mind?
Not to me. It's really ironic, and I just found out, really within the last few years from my sister, that how my mother reacted and how the men in the family came to my rescue and says, "Well, he's Charlie." Grandfather used to call me Bo. Everybody in the South got a nickname, and said he's gonna be all right. And they in turn made it easier for the women because my grandmothers and my mother, they were all upset and crying and stuff. But they never said anything to me. The only thing that I found out from what happened then was a couple of years ago had my mother on a road trip, and she says to me, "I'm glad you guys did what you did." And that's the only time it had ever been mentioned. And I said, "Mom, what do you mean?" She says, "I remember making this trip many, many years ago, and there was no bathrooms along the way, and there were no restaurants where we could eat. So she says, this has been a nice trip because you can really relax when you travel from city to city." And that's the only inference my mother had ever made. So,
Well, how did that make you feel to hear her say that?
it acknowledged it, it validated my actions. I felt that we were doing the right thing.
Hello, we are delighted to be joined by Freedom Rider Hank Thomas with us today. Ms. Thomas, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you take us back to that day and your thoughts of driving up into Anniston and the events that happened afterwards?
Well, I had narrowly escaped being lynched in Winsboro, South Carolina. I was taken out of jail that night by the local police to a Ku Klux Klan lynching mob where I had to run for my life and just barely escape when a black man from Rock Hill rescued me. So I knew from then on that this was not going to be a ride to the beach. Uh, Prior to that, at age 19, it was simply an exciting journey. But now it had become serious. When we on the bus going into Anniston, it was a very somber moment for me. I knew just how deadly this thing could be. And when we reached the city limit of Anniston, the downtown streets had been cleared. There was no one on the streets. And then when we pulled into the area where the bus station was, that's when we saw the crowd. Crowd of white men started yelling and screaming. And the bus driver, I'm pretty sure, fearing for his safety, got off the bus and said, "I'm just a bus driver and I just brought them here." And of course, he disappeared quickly into the bus station. But he did do us a favor. He locked the door from the inside so the people on the outside couldn't get in. They started beating on the bus and literally rocking the bus and breaking windows. My seatmate was Ed Blankenheim, white man from Arizona, and it was our job to get off the bus and go into the black and white areas to make an official report. And Ed said to me, "Let's go." And I remember saying, "Ed, I think this bus station is segregated." He said, "But we got to go and make for sure." I said, "Ed, you're crazy. They're liable to kill us." And I don't know, a few minutes later, it looked like all of the windows were broken on the bus. And finally, another bus driver, was convinced either by the Greyhound Corporation or the Attorney General to get that bus out of there. He came aboard just as nervous probably as we were and started to drive the bus. Well, he couldn't because there was a group of men sitting down in front of the bus on the pavement. They finally moved, and as the bus was moving out quite slowly, I breathed a slight sigh of relief. But then I noticed at least 3 or 4 pickup trucks in front of the bus, not letting the bus drive any more than looked like 10, 15 miles per hour. And I looked behind the bus was a line of cars. I knew that wasn't good. Unbeknownst to any of us, the bus tires had been cut. As I look back on this, imagine now, those tires are super, super thick. And what kind of instrument was used to cut them? A few miles out of town, those tires went flat, right in front of a country store. And right there in front of that store was a crowd. Some of the people, we were told later, had just gotten out of church and they brought their children with them to watch the Freedom Riders get beaten up or killed. Young children were on the shoulders of their fathers. Once again, the crowd couldn't get aboard the bus. Shortly thereafter, after all of the windows were broken, glass shattered all over the place, somebody threw something aboard the back of the bus to set the bus afire. And the bus started burning quickly. A retired naval captain said to us, "Get down on the floor. That's where you can get some oxygen." That only lasted for a matter of seconds. I made the decision, as I look back on it, as to how I was going to die, because I was pretty sure I was going to die that day. If I got off the bus, the mob was going to beat me to death. If I stayed on the bus, the fire and the smoke will kill me. I thought by staying on the bus, at least I can die in a less harmful way. And the minute I took a whiff of that black smoke, the involuntary muscles took over. I had to get air. So I got up and I stumbled to the front of the bus. And I heard somebody outside say, "They're trying to get out. Hold the door, let's burn them alive." I got to the front of the door, and surely, maybe 2 or 3 men were holding the door shut. A few more seconds, I would have passed out from smoke inhalation. Luckily for all of us, the fire had reached the fuel tank in the back of the bus, and it blew out the back of the bus, and everybody ran, the men outside. And that was the way I was able, and the rest of us, to get off of that bus. But that wasn't the end. As I was coming away from the bus to get some fresh air, a man asked me, "Boy, are you all right?" And I guess I just so glad to get out of the bus, I nodded my head, yes. And then he hit me with an object, a ball bat, and I went down on the ground. And there's a picture of me on the ground and about to get up, and 2 men started coming toward me. Highway patrolman was there, and I looked at him, and he wasn't about to do anything. So I did something that was considered death-defying. I ran to him, and I used him as a shield. He pulled his gun, and there's a picture of me covering my face because I thought he was about to shoot me. And he fired into the air, and he said, "All right, y'all had your fun. Stand back." And we were all still suffering from smoke inhalation, and that's the worst feeling that you could have. You can't take a deep breath. You want water. And a little girl that I've since called the Angel of Anniston, Janie Forsythe, ran to her house and started bringing us water. And everybody stood around with a scowl on their face looking at her. And as she ran out of little paper cups, she brought a bucket of water and went from one person to the next, giving us water. That gave us a little bit of relief. The ambulance finally came, and it was a white ambulance company, and they would not take the Black Freedom Riders to the hospital. And so the white rider said, "You don't take them, you don't take us." The black ambulance company was called, and the rules applied to him also. He could not take white riders to the hospital. So finally we got to the hospital, and the doctors there would not treat the black Freedom Riders unless we went outside and around to the colored emergency waiting room. Of course, we refused to go because by that time the mob had gotten to the hospital. And they threatened to burn or break into the hospital to get at us, and told the doctors and administrative people to send us out. Well, we were not going to go out. I don't know how long we were there, and the negotiation going back and forth to Governor Patterson finally agreed to provide us not so much with security, but to make sure that no one interfered with Fred Shuttlesworth coming to get us. And that's how we got out of Anniston.
When you reflect back on that time, what are some of the first thoughts that come to your mind that you would want to share with us?
First of all, the tremendous changes that have occurred in this country. I think called the World War II veterans the greatest generation. I would say that we as African Americans and the Freedom Riders and the sit-ins were our greatest generations in changing this country. And on the 50th anniversary, I was given the key to the city of Anniston. What a change. What a change. And we were celebrated in Anniston for what we did. And obviously, the city itself could not be recognized from that day 50 years ago, Mother's Day.
Dr. Noble, after the bus burning, Mayor Claude Dear asked you to become chairman of the Biracial Human Relations Council. Can you talk to us about what that meant to you to be asked by the mayor?
Yes, he did. They did appoint me as chairman of the Biracial Human Relations Council. I want to say a word about what led up to it. It was appointed in 1963, and this bus burning was in 1961. But in 1962, two African American ministers, one Baptist and one Methodist, came to me and asked me if I'd talk to them about the situation in Anniston. I agreed, and they came, and they said to me, one was a Baptist, one was a Methodist. They said, we've been to one of the Baptist white ministers in Anniston, and they won't even talk to us on the telephone. We went to all the Methodist ministers, and they wouldn't talk to me on the telephone. So we said, let's try the Presbyterians. It's the only one left, I reckon. So they came, and we had a very good conversation. I was familiar with many of the problems that they were facing with, because I was raised on a sharecropper farm in Mississippi, and I knew the problems and felt deeply for them. So that was the beginning of doing something about Anniston. And our beginning was to have the Black Ministerial Association and the White Ministerial Association to meet together for a time. And that happened until ultimately the two formed one organization. And when the council was appointed, it was appointed with 5 white men and 4 black men. And they were wise in their appointing the white men, in that they appointed the president of a bank, and the executive of one of the leading businesses in Anniston, and also another one who was the city editor of the paper, and that had the community support, and that's what made possible for us to move forward. And we did begin to move forward and bit by bit make some changes. But immediately when it was announced, the biracial council, where every member of the council began to get harassing telephone calls and threatening telephone calls, which continued for the time that we were working on things.
Dr. Noble, I would be interested in the impact that joining the council had on yourself, your family, and your church. I would imagine a lot of people were not too happy about that decision.
Well, that's true, but let me first refer to my family. I realized that I was placing all of us at some risk with the violence that was going on, but my sweet wife was perfectly willing for us to do this because she said it's the right thing to do. And my three children were, one was in two of them were in high school, and so they were aware with what was happening to some extent. But what happened in the church was that by and large, the church felt that what we were doing in appointing a committee to try to keep down violence, they thought that was a good idea, even though they would not necessarily have been favorable of immigration. But by and large, we had warm support from part of the congregation, and the rest of the congregation just stood on the side to see what was going to happen. But there was never any effort to mistreat me since I was the chairman of it.
Dr. Noble, when you look back at that time, does one thing stick out to you about the events that happened, whether from the bus burning or to your appointment on the Human Relations Council?
Well, when the bus burned, it revealed two things. One was that the Klan was strong in Anniston, which we already knew that it was so. And also it revealed the general attitude of the population in Anniston, which I read at the time, was that we are glad it happened, but we're sorry it happened in Anniston. Well, that showed the sort of harsh attitude that was typical of the general South at that time. Later on, after the work of the Human Relations Council, as we gradually made some progress and did some things, we felt that there was definitely a change of attitude in the whole community. And I'll illustrate that by telling you that when we tried to integrate some of the things in Anniston, the first thing we tried to do was to integrate the library, which we thought would be the less difficult. It turned out to be very difficult, and when the two African American ministers who had come to me went to the library having been planned by the Human Relations Council and the library board, they went on a Sunday afternoon to check into the library. They were met by a mob of about 50 or 60 Klansmen and other hoodlums who attacked them very much and beat one of the ministers up pretty badly. The other one wasn't quite that bad. Well, the Human Relations Council at that time reacted by getting together and saying that we will not tolerate this kind of violence in our community. As a matter of fact, President Kennedy had been informed about the formation of the Human Relations Council, and he had contacted the mayor of Anniston to congratulate him on having done this appointment, because no no mayor in any southern city would appoint such a committee at that time. And so a little interesting incident as we met to say that we were going to not tolerate this in the community. One of the members said, let's call the president. He got us into this anyway. Well, we did call the president, and he wasn't there, but he came in, landed. He was in flight somewhere, and he landed, and he called us back, and we talked to him, and he hoped everything would be all right. But following that, we had to assure the black community that we were not willing for that kind of behavior to be carried on in our community. To give you another incident, a little bit later, actually in 1965, some hoodlums from the Klan organizations came and stirred up the local Klan, and they went out one night to find somebody to kill. Well, they followed a car of a young black man who was coming home from work and who had had no involvement whatsoever with what was going on about human relations. And they shot through the back of his car and hit him in the head, and he died a couple of years later. Now, I tell that to say that what happened in the community then was one of the doctors in the community called 10 or 15 of the leading citizens of the community together. And that night, they raised $20,000 to be given to someone who would indicate who it was that did this shooting. And the next weekend, on Sunday, they appeared in the Sunday's paper a full page ad of about 300 of the most best citizens in the community signing something that said, we are not going to be able to tolerate this kind of activity in our community. Now, that was a good bit of different attitude in the general community than you found in Birmingham and otherwise. And we think it was because of the Human Relations Council having a certain success in bringing about agreement and progress in terms of improving what was happening in Anniston.
Hey, Chris. Hey, it's good having you here. And Chris Butcher is with the National Park Service, of course. He is superintendent of both Freedom Riders National Monument and Birmingham Civil Rights Monument, of course, in Birmingham. And listen, a lot has happened. I wish more had happened over the last couple of months. But so many things are happening in Alabama and throughout the Southeast as it relates to civil rights, heritage, tourism. Give us a tour.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So much is happening. You know, we're seeing, demographic shifts all throughout the country, and there's just, I think, an increased desire to know that story. And I think we're seeing every day that those stories are just as important and just as relevant today as they were when they happened. So there's a desire from the National Park Service and really nationwide to make sure that these treasures, these sites are maintained, forever. And Medgar Murley Evers' home is being phased up as a National Park Service site and unit. And like you mentioned, Birmingham Civil Rights and Freedom Riders were established in 2017, but we're still working every day tirelessly to gear up those operations. And so there's absolutely been an increased interest, I think, nationwide in the public to these stories and to these sites, and the National Park Service is trying to respond accordingly.
That's fantastic. How about Montgomery?
Yeah, so Montgomery is another site. Actually, several sites in Montgomery received grants from the National Park Service, and we are working with the Freedom Rides Museum and a lot of folks in that area to tell that story. Montgomery is really, kind of transitioning and pivoting, establishing itself to be a kind of a tourist hub for the African American experience in that story. With the lynching museum and memorial, and then the Freedom Rides Museum. There's such a rich history and story to be told.
So, Chris, how does Freedom Riders National Monument fit into this picture?
So I think Freedom Riders National Monument, it encompasses a lot of stories. The Freedom Rides, I think for me personally, before I kind of jumped into this position, you think of the Freedom Riders, or a lot of folks do, I think, as an Alabama story, or maybe an Anniston story, and a Birmingham story, and a Montgomery story. But it's really an entire South story that goes nationally and it goes globally. That's really where Freedom Riders comes into play. Is it's so important for us to understand how relevant those stories are, because they talk about fundamental issues of hate and inequality and injustice, which are, again, global issues that we're still tackling and dealing with today.
Yeah, that's right. How the Freedom Riders responded is a model for the rest of the world in so many different ways.
You're exactly right. And again, I wish I knew who to attribute it to, but one of the Freedom Riders I heard quoted saying that you can't bend steel until it's hot. And I think, the act of nonviolence is really what, in the face of such terrible, aggressive hate and violence, is really what touched people who were watching it and were maybe kind of indifferent, let's say, to the whole the situation. You really can't see the photos and hear the stories from the people who experienced it and not be moved and touched and not be compelled to say, that's not right.
Yeah, I get it. The heat will burn you, but it was a flashpoint.
Yes.
And
right.
so it's also personal, for all of us. But you in particular, I know, with some Birmingham roots yourself. How is the Freedom Rider story personal to you?
Yeah, so I grew up, I'm biracial, so my dad is black and my mom is white, and I grew up in rural Ohio, but there were still issues. I still remember to this day when we would go out to dinner, the whole restaurant kind of stopping and staring at us, and the feeling in your gut, when you're a little kid, thinking, this is weird and uncomfortable. But even more than that, in my hometown of Athens, Ohio, there's Ohio University. And my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, was the first African-American graduate from their school of journalism. Wow. And so when he graduated, he couldn't get a job in his hometown because they weren't hiring, black journalists at the time. So he went to Chicago and worked for the Chicago Defender and did some freelance work for Jet Magazine. And that's really where he kind of started his journey through covering the civil rights movement. And he eventually stepped down from those positions so he could kind of work more full-time in the civil rights movement. And growing up as a kid, just sitting at his feet, hearing the stories of talking, the times he met Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King, and he has letters from Malcolm X, and those were just hugely impactful stories in my life, and trying to understand where I fit in this world. And so when there was an opportunity to come here and be a part of helping to preserve these stories for future generations, I just had to throw my hat in the ring, and luckily was selected.
Hey, for folks that are watching, what's next for Freedom Riders National Monument? I know Gurnee has some opportunities with the depot, and of course then 5 miles away there's the site where the bus had burned. Right. There's personnel stuff going on. There's restoration going on. What's happening?
There's a lot happening.
There's a lot happening.
Yeah, like we had alluded to, the site was given a presidential proclamation in 2017, and I think a lot of people expect that money comes right with that, and resources are just kind of flooding in, and unfortunately, it's a little slower process than that. So we're getting our appropriation every year and scaling up our operation that way. We're hoping and developing plans to restore the bus depot to where it was that day in 1961, so folks can really take that step back in history. One of the great things about Gurnee is to this day, it's still very similar and largely the same as it was in 1961 with the building facades and everything. And so there's a great opportunity for folks to really kind of transport themselves back to that moment in time.
Tell us a little bit about the Federal Courthouse project.
So the Federal Courthouse is actually coming to Anniston, and they're going to be across the street in on Gurney Avenue there. And they've actually been a really great partner. They understand the impacts of a brand new kind of monolithic structure and what that could do to the historic landscape and what we're trying to do with the Park Service. So they've engaged us very early on. They've invited us to a lot of the landscape design and planning meetings to really try to collaborate and provide a space that we could use as well and really make it something that is a benefit to the community at large.
Well, I know it's with special thanks to our congressional delegation, Congressman Rogers, and especially Senator Shelby. This is all being made possible. But man, when you think about it, to have a new federal courthouse, which I understand may have some civil rights related interpretive materials associated with it, next door to the bus depot, the interpretive sites, and the synergy of all of that would really makes me feel like more and more people will be coming to this area to learn the story of the Freedom Riders, and that's really exciting.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's the hope, right, is to really expand the number of people who hear the story and are impacted by the story.
Well, we appreciate the county, we appreciate the city, and also we appreciate the acting superintendents that preceded you, Reggie Tiller, Reggie Peoples, Barbara Taggart, and I'm glad you're going to be with us for a while. So really, thanks for what you've done so far, but mostly thanks for what you're going to be doing. Seth, it's great to have you here, and it's great to introduce a colleague, Seth Johnson, who's the chairman of the Jacksonville State University Art Department, now director of Longleaf Studios.
Right.
And luckily, we were able to work with Alabama Public Television in landing a Freedom Rider documentary that will be released at the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. And this is going to be quite a production.
Absolutely. We're really excited for the opportunity. When we met with APT in early 2019, they gave us the charge to tell a different perspective of the story. There have been numerous documentaries done on the events of May 14th, 1961, but we wanted to give it a perspective of the community. What impacts did that event have before, during, and post after the event? And so trying to talk about Anniston and the impacts that this event and the national coverage that was received, what did that do to the community of Anniston? So we're really excited. We have partnered with a very talented production studio, Prodigy Arts. We have Chris O'Connor with us today, and he's directing and is going to be able to tell us all about what they have up their sleeves for this production. We're really excited.
Well, thank you so much for having us. We're so excited about this project, and it's really given us an opportunity to retell a story from a different perspective in a different way, and be able to tell it and engage a new audience.
I hear you. And Chris, it was great to meet you in Anniston 2 months ago before COVID. And
yes.
But I'll say it again, in that this documentary is just so important. Not that there haven't been other documentaries. There have been spectacular documentaries about the Freedom Riders. But at this particular time, these Freedom Riders are not as young as they used to be. And this, in many ways, is the opportunity to capture stories that just hadn't been captured. And I'll add, before it's too late.
Yes, I agree. And I think it's going to be great for us to be able to tell this story, like I said, in a different way. Of course, the story has been told, and there has been a documentary filmed around the incident. But we want to tell the story in a more cinematic way and film this and write this more in a more story format, where we kind of follow specific individuals and allow them to tell their story from the beginning to the end, and really have the Anniston story. What was it like before this incident happened? What was it like leading up to this incident? What was the tension? Just really following specific individuals through their journey from beginning to end. So we have the young lady who offered the water to one of the Freedom Riders who was choking there. And what was her life like before? I mean, being able to give a perspective of some of the children or people who were young at that time. You know, we never got that perspective. So you're young and you're hearing conversations, adult conversations, and what are the parents talking about, and what are some of the anxieties you felt in your household leading up to the bus coming to Anniston. And so I think it's a great opportunity to be able to really to film this and tell this story in a cinematic way.
I want to give them some credit too. They have won, I don't know how many Emmys you guys have won, but they are a very, very talented production studio. And that was one of the primary... Five. Yeah, that was one of the primary reasons I wanted to work with them.
How many was that again?
5.
But their cinematic expertise and storytelling skills, they are phenomenal. And I have utmost confidence in their ability to be able to tell this story from a different perspective with this highly polished cinematic feel. So I'm really excited to be able to work with them and to partner JSU and Prodigy Arts. I just can't wait to see the final result.
There are so many important places in Montgomery related to civil rights tourism. What is there for those interested in freedom rides?
So for those folks who are interested in learning more about the Freedom Rides story, they can visit the Freedom Rides Museum, which I am now located at. The Freedom Rides Museum is located in the historic Greyhound bus station. It is the only site currently in the country that exclusively focuses on the history of the Freedom Rides as a museum. And we opened the museum in 2011. We have been open for 9 years this May. And the site tells the story and chronicles the history of the Freedom Rides, the entire Freedom Rides, but specifically focuses on the story, the part of the Freedom Rides that happened in Montgomery in 1961.
And I would be remiss if I didn't ask about how are you all dealing with the pandemic at this current time in the museum. I'm assuming you all are closed, or is there virtual tours that people can access, or how does that work during the pandemic?
The museum physically, the building itself is physically closed to the public during the pandemic. Because we are a historic site of the Alabama Historical Commission, the Alabama Historical Commission is the State Historic Preservation Office. It's an agency of the state. And so when the state government issues an order, it affects our museum. And the governor declared stay-at-home orders on March 16th, or that went into effect sometime in March, and we've been closed ever since then to the public. However, we have taken a lot of our resources and programming and activities online on the Freedom Rides Museum Facebook page and on our Instagram page. There's also information from the Freedom Rides Museum being posted on the Alabama Historical Commission Facebook page as well. So people can interact with us and engage with us through social media currently. We hope that we will be open back up to the public very soon.
Do you all have something new in the queue for the future?
We have been very pleased to be partnering with the National Park Service and other representatives in places across Alabama that tell part of the story. And so we are very excited that we're going to be working with our partners to present virtual events in honor and commemoration of the 59th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, May 14th through the 21st. So all of that information will be presented online virtually because of the closing related to the virus. However, we are using all of our abilities to engage with people who have stories and freedom riders to participate with these virtual events for this year's commemoration. We want the world to turn their attention to Alabama for this moment in time that we're commemorating for the 59th anniversary. It is a moment for us all to take in and reflect on the legacy and the courage of the Freedom Riders. So we're excited about partnering with others to present these stories that in some cases haven't been presented before. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to learn more about not just the Freedom Riders, but other people who played a role during the Freedom Rides, whether they were supporters or not. this is an opportunity to engage the public on a broader story and a broader narrative. And Alabama was at the center of that, and Montgomery certainly played a pivotal role. And that's why we're here. That's why the museum is here, because of the pivotal role that Montgomery played. And we're very thankful we get to tell this story in part of the place where it happened. Our museum is located in the historic Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, which is the site where student freedom riders, including John Lewis, were attacked by a mob on May 20th, 1961. So the dates that we have set aside for the anniversary virtual events this year coincide with the historic dates from 1961.
Well, before this is over, we wanted to give a shout out to the Anniston Area Freedom Riders Park Committee. And that's Georgia Calhoun, Teresia Hall, Walter Prater, Willie Duncan, Trudy Munford, Bernard Emerson, Anthony Dixon, advisors, Barbara Boyd, Mitch Rogers, and especially our co-chairman, Bill Harbour. Dr. Harbour wasn't able to join us for this interview, but we thank him for his role as an original Freedom Rider. We wish him and all of those who participated in this project well. Now, Philip, special thanks to you too.
We would like to thank our partners, Jacksonville State University, the National Park Service, the Freedom Ride Park Committee, and the Freedom Ride Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, for their support in putting this project together. We look forward to 2021 for the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Riders and the Freedom Rides. Thank you and stay safe.